Perfect. Hello, everyone. My name is Rose. I am the community educator at Women's Advocates. And joining me is my amazing co-host, Taylor. Um, we will be co-hosting this together, guiding you guys through all the questions, all the information regarding today's webinar called MMIP, Sexual Assault Advocacy. I will hand it over to Taylor to introduce herself.
Hello, everybody. I'm Taylor. I'm the sexual assault advocate at Women's Advocates, and I'm very excited for the discussion today. Thank you, everyone who's here.
Amazing. And if you are just joining, if you would like, by all means, feel free to introduce yourself in the chat, your name, your pronouns if you'd wish, where you are from, where you're zooming in from, and what are you hoping to learn today. But with that, I am going to talk just a little bit, very briefly here about Women's Advocates as an organization. We are a domestic violence shelter located in St. Paul, Minnesota. We offer all sorts of safety resources. One of those is webinars, exactly what we are doing right now to educate the public about domestic violence, sexual assault, anything of the sort. We offer emergency shelters and advocacy services, housing stability services for victim survivors who are staying in our shelter. If you know anybody who could use our resources or want more information about domestic violence, anything about domestic violence, feel free to refer them to us, tell them about us. I'm going to copy and paste our website in the chat if you'd like to check out any events, anything that's coming up, future webinars that we have coming up. By all means, click on the website and visit that. But moving us along here, we have three different parts today that we will be covering. So part one is about sex education, consent, and healing in the Native communities. Part two is Native existence has been made political by the US government as ongoing efforts of settler colonialism. I'm sorry. And then part three, talking about how we can be a good ally. What does that look like and sound like? Again, joined by our wonderful panelists who will have a lot to add and share on all of these topics. Right now, I will hand it on over to our panelists to introduce themselves. Please introduce yourself and answer the questions. What are your roles in the community and why was it important for you or your organization to be a part of this conversation? We can
I
start off
can,
with Holly, by all means.
yeah,
Go for it.
bonjour. Anin, miska tuswaptanom Indigenous cause, give me wanabo, kwe Indigenous cause, makwan and dudam of gokin and dunjaba, wewe wachi and dunjaba, ashke bigazibing and dea. Chimi Gwech Miogo. My English name is Holly Henning. I'm the executive director here at Women's Advocates. I come from the Constance Lake Cree First Nation and Martin Falls First Nation in Northern Ontario, Canada. I'm Bear Clan and am just really excited to be here and share space. I just wanted to send a welcome to everyone and Chimigwech, thank you for Alex, Lenny, Amy, Tawny, and then Rose, Taylor, and Sienna, who have been doing some work to plan this panel. So after this, I will just be kind of here to observe and support however. So Chimikwech, and I will pass it to you, Miss Alex.
Hi everyone, good afternoon. I hope everyone is enjoying the nice weather. I'm hoping it will help with some of the things happening up north. Um, Again, my name is Alex McDougall. I'm the Director of Outreach and Youth Engagement. I've been at Women's Advocates for about a year and a half now. So I work with a lot of the youth programming and then safe harbor services. So it ties pretty directly into what we're talking about today. I come from White Earth Band of Anishinaabe in northern central-ish Minnesota. Excuse my dog, she's being very nosy. Um, I am Crane Clan, and then as far as roles in community, I like to think I have a lot of different roles. I'm a sister, I'm a daughter, I'm a friend. I obviously work within community in domestic violence, sexual violence prevention, all of those different things. So a lot of different aspects of my identity. I will just leave that there and I will pass it to Lenny.
Good afternoon, everyone. I always like to introduce myself and my spirit name. My spirit name is Tunkawanakhilita, which means Redstone Ghost. My English name is Lenny Hayes, and I'm from the Sisseton Wahpeton Oyate of the northeast corner of South Dakota. I am founder and owner and operator of Tate Topa Consulting. My professional background is in mental and chemical health, but I'm also a local, national advocate, specifically talking about the violence that's put upon our Two-Spirit and Native LGBTQ population, as well as our Native men and boys. I am connected to a lot of organizations, making sure that the voices of these two populations are heard. So with that, I will pass it on to Amy.
Hello, good afternoon. I am Amy Arndt Buzzard, actually now. I'm not a Wachholtz anymore. But I come from the White Earth Nation in northern central-ish Minnesota as well, Crane Clan. I have been working in community for many years. One of my first roles was as a sexual assault advocate for the DOVE program for the White Earth Nation. I spent 13 plus years at the Minnesota Indian Women's Resource Center working with women and survivors of sexual violence and trafficking. It has sexual violence. I'm a survivor myself, and it has affected our family and our community. And so I am here just to be part of this conversation, answer any questions. I also want to put out there that there's no such thing as a stupid question. I'm open for anything. So I just want to open that door and make sure that we can have a really good conversation today. So thank you. Who am I going to pass it to next? Let me see. Tawny?
Yes. Hi there, everybody. My name is Tawny Smith-Savage. I'm here today representing the Missing and Murdered Indigenous Relatives Office for the state of Minnesota, which is a part of the Department of Public Safety in the Office of Justice Programs. My original homelands are Northern Nevada, the Pyramid Lake Paiute Reservation. I am Paiute Shoshone. And I was raised by my grandma, I was raised by my mom, and a lot of aunties. And so it's wonderful to be on this panel today. I'm excited to share a little bit about the work that we do within our office, as well as share some of the insights that we've been learning in the last few years since the office has been open. So I will now pass it on to the moderators. Thank you.
Thank you all for introducing yourselves and for being here today to talk about this very important topic. With that, I will move on to part one of today, talking and diving into sex education, consent, and healing in the Native community. So, wanting to start off with this slide talking a little bit about advocating for youth. A little bit more context before we dive deeper into the questions that we have ready for the panelists. We want to talk about ways to advocate for youth because the issue we have at hand is lack of discussions around sexual education leads to higher rates of violence. So some ways and how we can kind of address the issue includes educating and advocating for youth, understanding generational differences around education and educating about sex and consent due to historical trauma, and finding out ways how to re-engage in these conversations as a community. So with that in mind, I'm going to hand it on over to Taylor to kind of guide us through the questions that we have ready for all of you.
Okay, so I'm just going to kind of read through the questions and then I'll hand it off to the panelists to kind of dive in. So, for our first question, given the generational differences in how sex and consent are discussed due to historical trauma, how do we introduce these conversations in a way that fosters healing? Question 2, how can traditional teachings about sexuality, relationships, and consent be reclaimed to support both education and victim survivor healing? And then the final question, how can we create safe, supportive spaces for Native youth to learn about consent, healthy relationships, and bodily autonomy?
So I can start us off. Okay. So part of my role as the MMIR Violence Prevention Coordinator within the state of Minnesota is really to start doing the community level response to MMIR violence. Some of the things that we do in a comprehensive way is really taking a look at those conversations that need to happen in the home. One of the things that I've really identified is within our Indigenous community and family systems is that multi-generational household that is often the case. So I love the first question because it talks about the generational differences on how communication about sex and consent are discussed. I think that one of the first things that we need to understand and acknowledge is that our elders have really gone through a lot, and really putting their safety and their roles and their knowledge, their stories at the forefront, and respecting that during a time in their lives, like that silence was a part of their survival. And so for our elders today and for the people coming forward as survivors and sharing their stories and passing the stories of survival to their younger generation is so important. And so that cultural grounded education in the home is really what I'm supporting, as part of that comprehensive approach to beginning those conversations. I think feedback that I've gotten from the community too is ensuring that we identify cultural identity through cultural arts such as regalia making, language programs, storytelling, dancing. And these are all ways that I was taught growing up. Like I said, I grew up with my aunties, my grandma, my mom, and all these things were taught in the home in such a beautiful way. We did a lot of the cultural camps, and as an adolescent, that was so key to really getting to the point where we could share other discussions such as consent, what is consent, and really beginning that conversation around healing, and making sure that we're coming forward in a respectful way. So I feel like I was pretty lucky in that those early teachings were given from a perspective that really instilled those protective factors early on. So part of the role that I have currently is really trying to identify the current family systems, programming that the tribes are already seeing progress in, and really building onto that and making sure that we can identify what does that mean today in terms of MMIR, missing and murdered Indigenous relative, and really looking at prevention. And from a prevention standpoint, we're going to need to continue those conversations and that healing in a cultural way. So yeah, so I just wanted to kind of share that. If Lenny, I saw you were kind of nodding there. Did you want to add to that?
Well, yes, thank you, Tani. So for me, when these specific questions are asked, one of the things that I try to get people to understand, especially, I represent the Two-Spirit and Native LGBTQ plus community at a state level, but also national level, and having all these conversations with our Two-Spirit elders. Those elders were originally there in 1990 when the word Two-Spirit came about. But one of the things that, and even after talking to scholars who identify as Two-Spirit, those conversations when we talk about sex is that understanding of how much that historical intergenerational trauma has impacted this community. One of the things that through my own education and awareness that I do across Indian country is reminding people that before colonization, these individuals were considered spiritual beings because of the roles that they played in community. Today we are looked upon as sexual beings. And the reason why I say that is because when historical trauma impacted this population, it changed the view in how our tribal communities looked at these individuals. We became sexual beings. We lost that whole idea of being spiritual beings within our community, meaning the roles that we play in community. So for me, I always say to people, being a mental and chemical health therapist and having my own private practice and working with Native people, I would probably be considered a medicine person because I sit with people, I talk with them, I counsel them. So that would be my role in my community. And one of the things that has happened to our community as a whole is that whole idea about sex being healthy. And that has to do with a lot of the trauma that's been impacted on us from the beginning of colonization to our boarding schools, which makes it very difficult for our community to even have that conversation. So, what I've seen through the years, because I've been doing this work for quite a long time, I think in 2010 is when I really started doing this work, is reminding people that sex is not a bad thing. It's a human thing. But because of colonization, that's how it has impacted us because it's looked upon as being bad. I've been put in situations where I've been invited to tribal communities to talk with youth because of so many horrific things that were happening. Specifically, one tribal community was struggling because there was what we could say is rape that was happening, meaning that these young men were taking pictures of having sex with these young girls while they were passed out and putting it on social media. And what that tribal community wanted I and another elder advocate to do was just specifically using that strong language with them. They said they need to hear that that is rape, right? But we also need to understand too that our tribal communities have been impacted by so much sexual violence in so many different ways. Specifically, even the work that I do right now, working within a team of 5 other Native men who have all been impacted. We've all been impacted by some form of violence, some form of sexual violence, some form growing up in domestic violence, seeing all of that, but also all of us doing our healing and trying to be good relatives to other Native men and boys, and even our males who identify, showing them that healing is possible. And so we're bringing this education and awareness that's important, but also the number one thing that we're doing is trying to create a safe space for them, so that we can have these conversations and really educating about what is consent. It's been amazing these last 3 years that we've been really doing this work. So with that, I could say so much more, even as a mental health provider, because I do work with a lot of our relatives who have grown up in very dysfunctional homes. And the thing that I always say to the relatives is that I'm here to help you, but if you're willing to give in order to create that healing for yourself, I will guide you through that. So, but also having that whole idea that I'm a relative helping another relative. So with that, I'll pass it on to Amy.
Thanks, Lenny. So I'm just kind of writing down ideas as we're going through these questions. So regarding question 1, how do we introduce these conversations in a way that fosters healing? What comes to my mind is that more often than not, sexual violence is multi-generational, right? So, I've experienced it. My mother has, my grandmother has, and that's unfortunately and sadly often the case. Um, how we used to talk about sex, how we used to talk about our bodies, childbirth, pregnancy, hunting. I mean, all of these things is from our community, right? It would be a conversation. Women would come together, and talk to the younger women, and it was beautiful, right? This is all natural. I think what has happened is that with historical trauma and generations of our people experiencing sexual violence, there's been, a rift, right? I mean, there clearly, and so those teachings are not coming down within our families, through our mothers, through our aunties, through community. And so creating space, what I think of is, I think oftentimes we think let's create space for our young people, right? Let's create this education. Let's create this. I think it would be more effective. My opinion is multi-generational, and even creating space for multi-generations within families to come in and have these conversations. Making sure that there's supports, making sure that we're using our medicines, but being able to open it up in a way that is safe, but also educating, because we need to restart this process within our families and community, of having these conversations and that they're natural. Um, and so to me, that's what I think of, right? Because, a young woman who she should be going to would be her mother, her aunties. And so we also have to um, bring in those people, right? The aunties and the moms, and include them in this process. And then also another thing what I'm thinking of is, and I know Lenny can speak more on this, but we need to create space for our young men. We need to create space when it comes to consent. Of course, for our young men, our young women, our two-spirit relatives. But I think so often we're focusing on women, and we need to expand that, right? I mean, even if we're talking about sexual violence or sexual or domestic violence, I should say, so many people say it's a woman's issue. It's not a woman's issue. It's a men's issue, right? For the most part. And so educating our young men too, who I think often get left behind, and being able to create that space for them.
Mm. Yeah. Can I add a little to what Amy said too? She really sparked some ideas and reflections. So some of the resilience that I've seen in the past year around working with youth has really been about youth leadership. It's just amazing when like we were talking earlier, Lenny, about the Red Lake Runners, and them doing their spirit run from Red Lake community all the way to Bemidji for the MMIW event in Bemidji this weekend. And that's just powerful. That sends a message of solidarity, truth telling. And I really feel like, the multi-generational work that was done on that day, you could see throughout the building. You could feel the energy. You got to see the mentorship that naturally was happening with the adults who were helping lead that run, community role models. I think that also I've seen tribal communities really identify, those safe spaces within their own community and really advocating for continued safe space for our youth, because that that message that you talk about, Amy, about like, you know, this is something we can't continue to do, which is that violence, the domestic violence, the sexual violence. That message is loud and clear, and more people are saying it, and that's what really helps. So I'm really glad to hear both the panelists, Lenny and Amy, really like echo that. It's really powerful.
So just to follow up too with what Amy said, so in the work that I have been advocating in regards to sexual violence across Indian country, the many conversations that I've had with adult men in regards to, you know, the subject of sexual violence, you know, I've been often asked a lot of questions, and you know, one that really comes to mind for me is him describing a elder in the community who was talking badly about just men in general, two-spirit males, all of that. And he was like, I try to approach in a good way, and by calling out the behavior, right? And he said, sometimes I get pushback, like I'm pushed back and I'm the bad person for saying what I'm saying, right? Because I want to be supportive for the community. And one of the things I said to him is, I said, you know, I've said this to several other men who are really trying to be helpful in trying to educate our young boys and to break down these barriers and the stigma that we have. But I said, why don't you just simply ask that question? Who taught you that? That is a powerful question, because what it does is it puts it back on that individual, and for them to sort of, and they may or may not do it, but it also puts them in the position that you're calling them out in a good way, right? Because we have to remember a lot of the things that we are taught, what we say, what we do, and what we hear, we act out. So, like when I work with Native parents, one of the things that I always say to them is remember to be careful what you say around children, because they hear what you're saying. And then that's how that behavior becomes an issue if it's not being corrected in a good, healthy way. And so they grow up thinking that it's okay to say and do the things that they do, right? But it also has to come from us as adults to be willing to change our own behaviors and thoughts and be able to teach these young people, these young men, that we're just human beings. We're not such sexual objects, right? And the identity of two-spirit people is not a bad thing. Colonization did that to us. And so, I mean, I could go on and on, because, you know, I've worked with a lot of our relatives, and I've never worked outside of Native community. I've always worked within Native community. So I've never worked with non-Native people, because I really believe that our people can heal. I am a survivor, you know, just like, you know, I have publicly said that in the work that I do, that I'm a survivor of many forms of violence. And through my own healing is why I give back to the community, because I do believe that our community can heal from the harm that was put upon us.
Thank you to the three of you for sharing. And for the audience watching, if you guys would like to have any sort of follow-up questions or any input, any thoughts that you would like to add, by all means, write them in the chat as well. But thank you to the three of you for sharing and answering these questions. Hopefully, again, those watching are able to kind of learn and pick up on a lot of these very great things being shared today. But with that, I'm going to move us on to part 2. Native existence has been made political by the U.S. government as ongoing efforts of settler colonialism. And so again, just a little bit more context in what this is about. On this slide, we want to talk about how Native existence has been made political by the US government. Federal and state policies also create challenges for tribal membership. We want to dive deeper into how these three things you see on the screen kind of interconnect. So starting off with land exploitation and exploitation of the Native community in general. This leads to things like mining, oil extractions, and pipeline projects, which then further leads to the increased violence against Native community. I will again hand it over to Taylor to guide us through the questions.
Okay, so question 1, how have colonial legal systems shaped the ways Native identity and sovereignty are politicized today? Question 2, how does land exploitation such as mining, oil extraction, and pipeline projects increase violence and sexual violence against Native communities? And the last one, what challenges do federal and state policies create when it comes to tribal membership, justice for missing and murdered Indigenous people, and victims, survivors of violence? I'll pass it on to the panelists.
What do you think, Lenny? You want to start?
Okay, and those are some really broad questions. But one of the things that, at looking at number 3, specifically talking about the Two-Spirit Native LGBTQ plus community, since this, and I don't want to get into this political stuff that's happening right now, because I think I finally got to a place where I'm just like, okay now, because when the new administration came in, and I think a lot of us Indigenous people were so impacted because we knew what was going to happen, right? And they showed what's happening right now. So I don't want to get into the political part of it, but I still have to admit that I'm very nosy and I have to watch political stuff so that I learn. But probably about a month and a half ago, 2 months ago, I was asked to revamp a coalition's 40-hour sexual assault curriculum. And because I have that experience, and so I said yes, I would do it. And then I got an email coming back saying you could only use LGB. And it really, really made me sad. It really really, really hurt me, because I have relatives who identify as transgender. I have colleagues who identify as transgender. And in order for me to get to thinking, I called one of my relatives. I do call, he's also a colleague, but he's also a relative that identifies, because I sort of in the Native way adopted him as a brother sister. And he's also an advocate. And so I had this conversation with him about what was happening. And what I said to him was, I don't know what to do. And he said, well, the first thing he said to me was, think about what's in your heart, what's in your mind, what is in your spirit, what imposes you to do this work for our community. And so I basically, we had a good talk, we had a good visit. And so I emailed the person who asked me to do this, and I said, I can't do this. No amount of money that you're offering me to do this, I will not wipe out a population, because I have because this population also represents my relatives, my colleagues, the people I work with, the community that I represent. I can't do this. And so with that, I feel very good about making that decision, because again, it's not about the money, it's about education and awareness, right? About sexual violence. But our trans people have been here before colonization. And we as a community looked at these individuals as human beings and the roles that they played in community. And the thing that I talk about is that, before colonization, we didn't have the things that they have today, right? We didn't have the hormones, we didn't have the operations, we didn't have any of that. So if there was a male that lived his life as a female, her life as a female, that's how the community treated that individual. It wasn't about sex. It was about treating them as a relative, as a person. And so what I also encourage when it comes to the missing and murdered Indigenous people is that I know that this movement was started by some powerful Native women, in which some of these Native women have become mentors of mine. They became teachers. And I remember one time I was so uncomfortable to start doing men and boys work. And I went to one of the aunties who's been doing the work, and I asked her, I said, how do I do this work without feeling like I'm touched on, like I'm stepping on the toes of all these beautiful, powerful Native women who have created this movement? And she basically said to me, she said, just do it. And so when I do this work, I come to this work with a lot of compassion, a lot of understanding. I check my own self and my own behaviors and my responses to people, because one of the things I always say to people, and this is my own personal belief, is that when you approach something with anger, people aren't going to respond. The walls are going to go up and they're not going to respond to you. And so I always try to respond in a really, really good way. But in this movement, what I've seen over the years also is that, in the beginning, it was a women and girls movement. And one of the things that I struggled with was often that we would have these individuals specifically speak about individuals who identified as Two-Spirit or Native LGBTQ+. And so I've always advocated that we as Two-Spirit people get invited to the table, because we can't have someone who identifies as straight speaking for someone who, like me, who identifies, because it would also be me like representing somebody who's straight, and I'm not straight. So we need to invite everyone to the table to have these conversations. And so that's what I've seen in the change in the movement, and how much it's changed and how much more it's accepting, because we do have missing and murdered Two-Spirit people out there. I worked for Sovereign Bodies Institute, which was one of the first Native organizations in the country that actually collected data. And I was their missing and murdered Two-Spirit project assistant. So I seen the data. And so I know, but also what I also know as a community member is that a lot of our Two-Spirit people who are shunned by their families, by their own communities, will often travel to the urban areas because they're looking for support and acceptance. And so we come together as a community to support one another and be there with one another. And when one of our relatives from our community goes missing, it's conversation between all of us. And so we know that data is much more higher. And I've seen so many difficult things happen to Two-Spirit people, where even our trans relatives that are found murdered and go back to their land with their people, often the families will bury them as their original gender and not respecting the gender that how they see themselves. And that's really sad and disheartening to see that. And also what's happening now too, within the community, within the trans community, is that because of what number 47 is saying, that there's only two genders, what's happening is that Native families are starting to treat their trans people in that way. I attended a meeting with one of my colleagues who's a national trans Native woman who's done so much for the trans community that she broke down in a meeting because her own family start calling her him. And one of the things I said to her was, I'm so sorry this is happening to you, but I want you to remember what you have done for the trans community, what you have done for me. You have educated me about transgender identity. And I want you to know that what you're going through right now doesn't mean that you're going to go through that the rest of your life, and that this administration is not going to be there forever. But lean on the people who love and support you. And I say that to all of our Native relatives because we are going to go through some hard times right now. We are going through hard times, and this is where we need to come together and support one another. So with that, I will pass it on.
I'll jump in quick. So what's come to my mind, especially with land exploitation, I guess, I think what most people don't know, when I worked for the reservation, when sexual violence, would spike, it would be like really significant spikes, right? It'd go way up. Usually it was twice a year, and of course, the entire year there's sexual violence, right? But twice a year it would just skyrocket. And those two times, fishing opener and hunting opener. And it was when non-native men would come to the reservation with their buddies and, stay for hunting, stay for fishing. And the fact that, we as Native women, or as Native people have been seen for a long time as commodities, right? Or we are dehumanized. And so keeping that in mind, also, with sexual violence, with rape on reservations, right? Is it going to be prosecuted? And so most often it is not prosecuted. So I mean, that's like a really deep discussion we don't have time for. But what I would recommend for any advocates who are non-native or who are not familiar with our community, is do your research. Ask somebody that you trust. Ask a coworker, right, who comes from our community, where can I get accurate information? And do your research. I think nowadays we have the internet. Everything's at your fingertips. And so, and that's part of learning, right? But also, we can be good allies, to each other. But it is important and it's vital that every single person who is working in our community is educate yourself, ask questions, do your research, and ask a community member, ask one of us. Like I'm always open for questions, right? But also, where can I get this information? And start with that. But it is really important, and I think it is a must if you are working in our community, if you are working with any Indigenous people, survivors, you have to educate yourself, right? And you have to listen because our ways are different, right? And what we face does look very different and how it impacts us. It doesn't impact just an individual, it impacts our entire community and our families. So that's what I got to say. Connie?
Wow. Wow. Yes, this is so intense. So some of the notes that I've taken from Amy and Lenny, who are just really so in tune with community, is that really what they're talking about in that first question is erasure, and so like Amy talked about that dehumanization, Lenny talked about taking away of identity. And these are things that Native people and Indigenous communities have to deal with every single day. So I do think that unfortunately there is that more than just politics. It's actually taking away of yet again, the things that are most vital to us, which is our connection, our connection to the land, which is in question number two, our question to our relatives, which is question number three. And we need to reclaim these, and these are actively happening. The reclaiming of through the movement of the MMIR movement and through the movement of reclaiming our land again. One of the things that I learned over the weekend was that intersection between land exploitation and MMIR. So one of the speakers was from the Indigenous Environmental Network, and she talked about what happens to the land happens to the body. Protect Mother Earth and protect Indigenous people. And for me, that really sank in deep. I was, very moved by that. And so recently, in speaking with youth, I've been really trying to engage them at the very beginning of the presentation of like centering them with the sun, with the mountains, with the trees, so that their spirit can receive the information, so that they're connected, intrinsically, and in thought, because that's where their connection is. And then talk about those difficult issues, educate them about the victimization, and increase their knowledge so that they can be survivors, they can be more aware, and then ending with that visualization back to the land, because we want them to make that change in their future. So I really feel like these are great questions because it is all interconnected. One of the things that I think about in question three is like, what are those challenges? And before this panel, I thought, okay, how do we address this? Because it's so complex. But one of the things that we saw early on in 2023 when we started doing this work was in Minnesota, that lack of coordination and data sharing. And so we know that's true with MMIR. There is no data. I mean, Sovereign Bodies was actually one of the first that started doing this research and really saying, hey, we have an issue here. We have something is happening. Pay attention, and I think that again, that's part of that erasure, is like when we start to not see the signs, we start to be too busy. It impacts like our understanding of what we really need to be paying attention to. So, like Lenny said, those advocates are so huge, in terms of like making sure we don't lose focus and we stay on track. So that lack of data sharing, the lack of coordination really can lend to like services, duplication of reports, no services to families, cases not being entered into databases like NCIC and NAMUS. These are all things that we're trying to improve here in Minnesota. Some of the things that we started doing early on is taking a look at what is our response to families. And so making sure that families aren't left just to navigate things on their own, really identifying a systems response, and finding those stakeholders within law enforcement that are willing to come together, take a look at some of the cases that we have, and make some shifts as needed. And we've been actually really been getting a lot of great feedback from law enforcement, which I feel like we need to, because I was just talking to our interim director this afternoon, and as we have conversations about racism, colonization, the historical impacts of some of these things that we know are root causes to MMIR, law enforcement needs to do the same, because we can share our vulnerabilities as an Indigenous community, but they need to also admit and start to take some accountability to some of those injustices. And so I think we're moving in the right direction. It's just about having conversation and making sure that we're in conversation all the time. And, like Lenny said, there could be some emotion. Sometimes it can be anger can come out, but always making sure that we stay on track, we stay aware, we stay focused, and always just, making sure that we're grounding ourselves in what we know is our truth, which is our land, and which is that connection to one another. So, Miigwech, Lenny, and Amy, thank you for, helping me with my response there.
You put everything together so eloquently, I just have to say. So thank you.
I just wanted to just quickly follow up with what Amy said, because that's really important when we go into these spaces, sometimes with non-native people. I remember, and as you could see, I'm a storyteller, so that's maybe something that I developed over the years that I've been doing this work. But a lot of the things that I want to say comes from storytelling, really. But I was approached by a non-native woman in Sioux Falls, South Dakota, and it was a faith-based organization that attended this this training that our men's team did along with a federal agency, and we were talking about male trafficking. But we also, for me, I just sort of educated them about the historical context, all of that, of intergenerational trauma. And I and two of us guys were standing outside, and this woman came out, and she was non-native. She was talking to us, and then all of a sudden she's like, "I love Indian people. I'm so sorry that happened to you all." And she started crying, and she's like, "I really want to help Native community," and just went on and on. And yeah, I allowed her to do that, but in a very good way. I said to her, I said, "Thank you. But first of all," I said, "please stop crying." And I said, "Second, what you can do is help change the system, because the system is what created all of this trauma on Native people." And that's all I said to her. Because it is the system, the government system is what created all of this harm and trauma on Native people. And what we see today is that a lot of white people are the ones who are running the government, right? But it's also good to see that we have Native relatives from all over Indian country that are stepping up and running for these seats in the House. You know, look at what's just happening across Indian country. That makes me proud, you know, but also just remembering that. So I just wanted to share that. Thank you.
Thank you guys for sharing all of that. And I think what you all were talking about takes us perfectly into our next part. But again, thank you all for your input. Again, very educational, great stuff. But again, what you all literally just said goes right into this. Can I be there, and what it's like and what it looks like and sounds like being an ally? And with that, talking a little bit more about how we can support. You guys talked a little bit about this already, but if you would like to add on more, by all means, feel free to do so. Knowing the boundaries around involvement and engaging. So how do you support without speaking for somebody, without speaking over certain people? And overall, just how to be a good ally. What does that look like, sound like? Again, if you have more thoughts, anything else you'd like to share, by all means, go for it. But Taylor, you can take it from here.
Okay, so our final two questions. So, what does meaningful allyship and advocacy look like in the Native community when supporting victim survivors of sexual violence? And what does it look like regarding the crisis of missing and murdered Indigenous people? And then finally, how do we create clear boundaries for non-Native advocacy and involvement? I know you guys already kind of talked about it, but.
Go ahead, Lenny.
Well, so again, I mean, I think just having this conversation, everyone knows that I've done a lot of advocacy work when it comes to Two-Spirit Native LGBTQ plus people. And I've often gone into spaces of non-native people and caused them to be uncomfortable. I'll just, let's say, put it that way. I met with the Human Rights Campaign director one time who had asked me to help them develop some work in regards to child welfare, our youth who identify as Two-Spirit. But I felt that I was compelled to educate this individual by telling them some of the things that I know that I've been taught by scholars, that I've been taught by Two-Spirit elders, but just specifically saying, before colonization, we had no such words for lesbian, gay, bisexual, or transgender in our languages. We had a specific word for those individuals. So when I talk about my own tribal community, the word for me is winkta, which identifies who I am. And also, one of the things that I talked to them about was the use of pronouns. And for me, I don't use pronouns because the reason why I don't use them is because I believe it's a form of colonization. And the reason why I say that is because I have that understanding that in some of our tribal communities, some tribal communities in their language don't have a word for male or female. And so I understand why this all came about, right? It was to help our transgender community and to be supportive. And I understand that. But what I didn't like was that we were being forced to do something that doesn't fit us as Native people, because we don't look at individuals in that way. We look at them as relatives and human beings, right? And so that was what I was trying to teach. And so I ran into a lot of walls of some of these non-native LGBTQ organizations that would sort of push us out. Like they didn't want to understand our Native identity in the role as Native LGBTQ plus or Two-Spirit. And so one of the things that I publicly said, and I will continue to say it, and I'm not afraid to say it, is that I believe that the LGBTQ community is an oppressed community overall, but also has become the oppressors. Because why not at a national level is the term Two-Spirit also with the LGBTQ? When we as Native people are First Nations people, right? So I'm happy to say through all of this work that I've been doing, and I was involved with a Native coalition from the Southwest, which formerly they called themselves Southwest Indigenous Women's Coalition, and now they simply call themselves SWIC because they want to be inclusive to not only my community, but also Native males who are also survivors of many forms of violence, which was a huge step with the tribal coalitions across Indian country because they were one of the first. But they were also not nice things were said to them because they chose to do that. And so I always say I give a shout out to Leanne Guy who helped our community because they were also one of the first organizations in the country to actually create a Two-Spirit Native LGBTQ plus advocacy advisory council, which they reached out to us to help them guide the work that they were doing addressing sexual violence against this population. So during COVID, we received a grant from the Nova Foundation to explore the idea of creating a national organization. And so during COVID, we as an advisory council went out and met with Two-Spirit community all over Indian country and simply asked that question, what do we need and how can we help you as a community? And so we took a lot of that feedback. So last fall, through 3 years of strategic planning and creating a board of Two-Spirit leaders from all over the country, there is now a national organization, which I'm very proud of. So they are called the Two-Spirit and Native LGBTQ plus Center for Equity, which is the first ever Native organization that will address all of the issues that we're talking today, specifically on the Two-Spirit community. So for me, that's a huge legacy that I'm leaving behind because I was part of that advisory council. And just recently I was asked if I would be able to sit on the advisory council for this new organization. And of course I said, yes, I would, because I do support the community. I do support everything that's happening. And we do want to go in and address all of these issues that impacts our community. So to give you something else to think about, in the country in 2015, when same-sex marriage was passed, I was happy for a minute and then sad afterwards, because I knew that this would not impact our tribal communities, because our own tribal communities are their own sovereign nations. So they get to create laws, right? So currently right now, out of 574 tribes in the country, there's only 30 plus tribes that allow same-sex marriage. And currently there's only a handful of tribes of those 574 tribes that actually have laws to protect Two-Spirit people from the many, many forms of violence. So, I just think of this because we know that we do have a lot of missing and murdered Two-Spirit people. I mean, I was saddened to hear several years ago when there was an elder who identified in here in Minneapolis who was found dead, where she identified as a Two-Spirit woman, but it was also sad because when they tried to connect her identity to her tribal community, nobody would come forward to claim. And that makes me sad because for us, even as tribal communities, that's what we have to do, is work together to help the MMIP, specifically this population. But thank you.
Thank you, Lenny. That's some really good information. And in fact, I think I got to meet one of your colleagues in Las Vegas last year. And so we had a great conversation looking at protocols and making sure that, we are fully engaging with all conversation so that we don't leave anyone out. I feel like for the question regarding allyship, one of the things that I talk about with the youth when I go to high schools, in universities, is I talk about the importance of taking a look at how you could contribute here in Minnesota. So a lot of people might know that we have the first license plate, the state plate for missing and murdered Indigenous relatives. And so, and this is just a little sticker I have put on the water bottles and things, but basically it's got the logo over the office, which is, it represents a person, with the red handprint, and really looking towards the east and the sun, which is the hope, for the future. So part of the funding that when you do purchase a specialty plate, $25 will go to the reward fund that's set up for the state of Minnesota. It's called Gajiye Mikwendigoziwag, which means they will be remembered forever. And that reward fund is annually provided that $25 if you get the specialty plate. And so many students immediately, they're new drivers and they're getting those plates. And so it just makes my heart soar when, I know that those young drivers are out there and they want to stand in solidarity. They want to stand, with strength and allyship. And they're ready. And so that really makes me happy. Other things that students have been really eager to do is go to different events. There are rallies and events every February 14th. Of course, we have a very large gathering in Minneapolis, and we have speakers and different things going on in throughout that week. Not just us, but just organizations throughout the Indian community, they are amazing. They come out and bring their art, bring their families. stand for and remember the loved ones that may be missing or have been murdered. So it's always a time of healing. As Indigenous people, we are complex. We can carry our grief and our strength and our happiness all at one time. This is our survival. This is how we have survived. Um, Another day that we've got is the National Day of Awareness, which is May 5th. And so in this month of May, I know that there are a lot of organizations that do something every week. Many of the tribes have their days too that are set aside where in their own community they bring in speakers, drum, dancing, and really highlight what are those services in their communities. If you are a victim or survivor, where are your resources? So being a good ally means knowing about those resources, understanding what is healthy advocacy. And I love Lenny's teachings he's giving right off the bat about, hey, just, you need to understand that if someone's being direct with you about your boundaries, it's okay, because that's what we do as Indigenous people, is we help one another understand in a good way. And it's not in a way that's discouraging. It's just in a healthy way of always, looking in, like you said, and always identifying, like, is there a boundary there? Am I asking the right questions? And many of our tribal communities have different protocols, different language, different elders who are identified as the individuals who make those decisions. And even for me, being an Indigenous person, but my homeland's being in Northern Nevada, coming with that cultural humility and understanding that, I'm Paiute Shoshone. However, I live in Ojibwe country, and Dakota land, and so. I always let people know when I go out and speak who I am, my background, so that people can put that into a context that they can understand, but also encourage them to go out into their own community and start asking good questions of their own relatives too, no matter what background they come from. Um, let's see here, other notes. One of the things too I've noticed is like taking pictures, or recording things like during prayers. Those are no-nos. And so media has a big role in really looking at advocacy. And so part of our work here in Minnesota is developing good, healthy media response for our families and communities. So it is respectful of the experience and not going into a community and creating more harm by doing, coverage on trauma that is disrespectful. And so currently in our office, we have a staff person who comes with her communications background and works directly with media throughout Minnesota so that she can help navigate some of the questions that they may have and help them develop a good side of like who we are as community and who a victim survivor may be from a personal perspective, not just the trauma that occurred. So those are just some of the things we're doing here, but I'll pass it on to Amy.
Thank you both. Kind of like half my notes are kind of null and void now. So I'm going to just kind of touch on, I'm going to focus on one thing, and this is advocates who are working in the Native community or with Native survivors. And I think this is something that we probably have all seen. And a lot of times we do not talk about. And so I think one thing is being open to having uncomfortable conversations and asking questions, right? You are a visitor to our community. You are a visitor in this space and respecting that space. Non-Native people fall in love with our culture and our communities, right? We have a very rich culture. We have wonderful people. And I think the way that we move with each other and we think of each other as relatives, I could run into Tani, in Washington State, you know what I mean? And I would know, and we would look, and there's a connection um, between us. I think that is not in other cultures, some other cultures, right? Um, and so, knowing that you are a visitor, knowing that to be respectful. We have different ways of healing. We have there's basic advocacy and then there's the additional advocacy, right? That oftentimes our people need when it comes to spiritual healing. And so just, being able to, ask questions, ask people, ask a worker, reach out. I'm always willing to be somebody, who can help out. But some like very common things that unfortunately come up is like, don't ask for a spirit name. Don't do it, you know. Um, you know, uh, you're not here to save anybody, right? And I think that's just in general in advocacy, is we are not in this to save anybody, because it's not about us. It's about the people that we're serving. Um, yeah, and then just listen, learn, respect, and be open to learning different ways. Because I think we don't even recognize um how different we are because we're in community, right? I mean, this is how we live, this is who we are. Um, but it can look very different to people who are not, part of community, who've grown up in it, so, being able to respect that and being a wonderful ally. I have some great allies on my team here and are just priceless members, right? And very respectful and know that they're an ally and make that being a good ally, um, that is one of their main focuses, when they are doing their work and are in community. So I think that's all I have. So thank you.
Thank you all again for sharing. Again, very insightful. Great things. But that is all the questions that we have. Are there any other thoughts before we move on to a Q&A session? Sounds good. So again, thank you for answering all the questions that we have for all three of you today. But if anybody watching, the audience, if you have any questions, comments, anything at all, that you would like to share or ask now, by all means, leave them in the chat. I'll give us a minute or so to let people gather their thoughts and type out their questions. If not, we can just move on. But right now's the time. If you are curious about anything, any questions, please, by all means. Anything comes?
I have a comment, Rose.
Go ahead.
I did put it in the chat, and I think for those of you who maybe weren't on when we had done introductions at the beginning, my name's Alex McDougall. I work at Women's Advocates. I just wanted to name kind of like the different intersections of like not only land exploitation and human exploitation, but also like what these different things look like as far as like loss of land and enrollment and all of those things. And I really did just want to kind of mention, and again, I know that I put it in the chat, but when it comes to like the politicizing of Native people that has been intentionally done by the US government, that is directly tied to land and land stewardship and who gets to take responsibility for taking care of any given piece of land, right? And so even when we look at crimes that are committed on tribal lands by non-native people, those crimes don't even get to, most of the time, there are exceptions with Violence Against Women Act, VAWA, like those types of things, but most of the time crimes that are committed on tribal lands by non-native people are not even able to be persecuted or handled by the tribal community itself that land or that crime has happened to. So typically the responses are from federal and state governments. And that in and of itself can be problematic, because if the people who are persecuting these crimes don't understand the effects, or maybe just, it's not community work from that aspect. And so a lot of times things can just get very quickly dismissed. And similar to what Amy had said, a lot of this is tied in with the things that are happening year round, such as fishing, hunting openers, but also things like blood quantum. Like all of these things are related. And so if, for example, there are not enough, or there aren't many people enrolled in a specific place, only enrolled members are typically able to get, like, quote, rights to that land. And so eventually that goes back to the US government. So I think like all of these different things are just really important. I just wanted to name it because it is all directly tied to missing and murdered Indigenous people, but it's also directly tied to the domestic violence that's happening in tribal communities, the sexual violence that's happening in Indigenous communities, and how that all directly ties to the land, and also is just a continued form of genocide. So I just wanted to say it. It wasn't a question, but that was it. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for adding that on, Alex. Good thing to know. And you did leave it in the chat. If I just tilt my head to the left here, I can see it. But thank you for that. And it seems like our panelists is right there with you and on everything that you kind of just said. I'm reading the chat. Some questions did come in. The first one being, I know this was touched on, but can you speak to what changes you would like to see in media coverage of MMIP and sexual assault? Would anybody like to take that one on?
Stop changing our words when we get interviewed. is one of them, because I've been interviewed by the media, and often what I've said isn't what I said. And so that has been a huge issue. And again, just being respectful, like Amy said, some of the things that, and even Tani, like what we do in community, during prayer or honoring, there's things that you don't do. The other thing that I would want to say to non-Native people specifically is that it is important to educate yourself and to bring awareness of what's happening right now with our current administration. A lot of non-Native people don't understand all this funding that's being cut, that nationally what may happen is a lot of our Native organizations that support this work are going to be shut down. That's the reality of it. And maybe having conversations amongst yourselves, like, how can we help? It doesn't mean that you lead the work, but what it means is having an understanding. Because what I always say too, and it's really important just to say it, is that a lot of our non-Native people will never understand what happened to us as Native people. They'll have an understanding, but they won't have that deep understanding of how it's impacted our spirits, our communities, how much healing that we've had to do for ourselves, how we represent ourselves in community, how we represent within our own families, and trying to be role models to our families. And the other thing too is just having that understanding when you do approach somebody who may identify, don't assume that they're going to call themselves Two-Spirit, because a lot of them who come from dysfunctional places don't have an understanding. Like I've had Native men say who identify, I don't identify as Two-Spirit because I don't know what that means. So I identify as gay, right? So I'm always reminding people, just simply the most respectful thing that you can do is just simply ask someone, how do you identify? Instead of putting labels on individuals, because we do live in a world of labels.
Yes, yes. Asking questions, asking good questions, those are all, that's where it starts. Some of the things around MMIW, MMIP in terms of media and reporting on cases, as we know, that's part of the problem is there is no coverage for our relatives, and so making sure that we're providing accurate information, we're asking good questions, we aren't generalizing, Indigenous people. So like it's not uncommon for a reporter to kind of assume that somebody is from a certain community when they're actually not. So I've seen that occur where people have to go on social media and correct the media because the media reported, like Lenny said, something incorrect, saying, that somebody was from a certain community and they're actually not. They were from a different community. So not, generalizing, Native people, making sure that there's consistent reporting, there's coverage, also mugshots. I got this question from students yesterday. They said, I don't like that picture that is used. Why are they using that picture? And I said, well, that's their driver's license photo or that's their mugshot. And I said, we don't prefer to use those. And I showed them a good one where it was a relative who was missing and they were sitting by the water. I said, this is them and their environment. This is because they are a relative. They're our community. And so we went through the exercise of taking a look at the Bureau of Criminal Apprehension clearinghouse database. And I said, what community do you live in? What county is this? And so we went through and they were looking, we live in Cass County. And I said, okay, we got 2 people who are missing, and one of them is Indigenous, and so they had a great conversation. And these are 6th graders. So even the 6th graders know what's right, what's wrong, and our media really should be taking responsibility and accountability in terms of doing a thorough job and respectful job for our MMIW families. Also, a suggestion too is not always referencing their criminal background. That a lot of times, I ask myself, why does that matter? It doesn't matter. They're a relative, because I believe that we can create the wrong message if, as media and as responsible, people in the community, if we're starting out in that way, so making sure that we show the human side of the people that we work with, and for. And so I just want to also put a plug in for our Wilder report. So this is all coming from a report that was done. So if you want to do more research and you want to learn more about media and recommendations, you can take a look at the report to the legislature done by Wilder Research called Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women Task Force. And so these are the original recommendations coming from that task force in 2020. And that's just the beginning. And there's actually another research report that was done in 2023 that built onto that.
Thank you for your input and answering that question. We have a couple more minutes here. The next question that we have is, what are some ways we can improve connections with our relatives located in settings based out of their communities for whatever reason? Some examples: homelessness, not being recognized as 2S, etc. Would anybody like to answer that one?
So one of the things that I want to also acknowledge is that we have some federal legislation that we fully need to be utilizing, and that's Savannah's Act. So we have a Great Lakes Missing and Murdered Indigenous Persons staff person from the Department of Justice who has really pointed us to Savannah's Act in terms of people who are Indigenous people living off the reservation. And I really feel like we should be taking a look at how we can leverage what's already out there, the learning that has already been done in terms of protecting our relatives who may be off the reservation, going to school, finding work, maybe they're unsheltered, living in an urban area, and being able to still provide them with services, with protections and acknowledgement, because we know that a lot of our relatives live in urban areas. So I think we really need to improve that understanding, and then also utilize the resources. So like in the Twin Cities area, we have many urban offices. And, I know, Amy, you talk about the advocates out there who might not know, but every tribal nation has an outlet in the urban area. And so if you don't know what those are, find them. So like Fond du Lac, White Earth, Mille Lacs, Leech Lake. I mean, I feel like every tribal nation has an urban, connection somewhere in the Minneapolis, St. Paul area, in addition to all our organizations that serve Indigenous people.
Thank you, Tani. And if anybody has any more questions, feel free to reach out directly to us. We can connect you with the right people. But for the sake of time, we are going to move on now. These are just more resources available from the amazing individuals who are joining us today. Thank you, Lenny, Amy, and Tani. These resources will be followed up with you. You will get a chance to view all the slides. So feel free to visit these links, the websites, and the contact info to reach out to any of our amazing panelists today if you'd like. These are our information at Women's Advocates, our crisis line. Again, you will get these slides in a bit here, but as we end off for the day, I am going to copy and paste our post-webinar survey into the link, into the chat. If you would like to take that post survey for us, that would be very, very highly appreciated. But we have reached the end of today's panel. Thank you, everybody, for joining, for watching, for being a part of the panel. This was really, really educational. It was great. I'm going to just put a lot more links into the chat in case you'd like to access the slides right now, to look deeper into the resources that we had available. That is the link. Another one for sticking with us and being here today, you do deserve a certificate of attendance. So feel free to click on this second link now to access the certificate of attendance. If you have your phone available, you can scan the QR code on the screen to get access to the slides today. But thank you all for being here. Thank you to our wonderful panelists. Thank you to everybody for joining. And I hope we were able to learn something new. A lot of great things were shared today. So thank you all.